The strange part is that the entire disaster kicked off over something most people barely notice anymore. Not passwords, not hackers, not money, just a cable. A single quiet line running from a utility pole into my house. Until one morning I woke up and realized someone had decided it was no longer mine. When I bought the small place on Alderbrook Lane, it wasn't because I pictured myself settling into some postcard-perfect neighborhood with manicured lawns and identical mailboxes. I bought it because it was affordable. It was sturdy, and it had a detached garage I could convert into an office. That was the plan. A door I could shut, a desk that stayed level, and enough silence to work without my neighbor's TV seeping through the walls. I worked remotely as a systems analyst for a private contractor. Nothing cinematic. No explosions. No collapsing satellites. Mostly infrastructure, redundancy planning, the kind of dull work that only becomes important when it stops working. But dull or not, the job required one thing above everything else: stability, low latency, a connection that didn't stutter when the rest of the block fired up Netflix at exactly 7 p.m. So I put money into it. Clean trenching, properly buried conduit, a patch panel mounted straight, a fiber modem capable of far more than I realistically needed, because that's how I sleep, knowing the system can absorb a hit and keep running. I was proud of it, quietly proud. I didn't brag, didn't give tours, didn't point it out to anyone, but someone noticed anyway. Her name wasn't actually Karen. That was just what people called her once they felt safe enough to do so. Officially, she was Lorraine Bellows, president of the Alderbrook Homeowners Association, retired, organized, unnaturally punctual, the type who didn't knock. Exactly. She'd simply appear in your peripheral vision and wait until you noticed her. She always had a clipboard, and that clipboard carried weight. Not physical weight, but social gravity. People straightened when they saw it. Conversations cut short. Dogs were leashed faster. Trash cans rolled back in a little quicker. At first, our interactions were harmless. Polite nods, neutral smiles, a comment about the weather. Then one afternoon, she stopped at the end of my driveway and tilted her head like she'd discovered a flaw in the fabric of reality. "Is that an antenna on your roof?" she asked. I told her yes. Part of the fiber termination, barely visible, painted to match. She frowned, wrote something down, and said she'd need to review the bylaws. That was the beginning. After that, there was always something. Questions about cable routing. Concerns over visual clutter. Complaints about a satellite dish I didn't even own. Once she accused me of running commercial equipment because a technician's van stayed parked on the street longer than she found appropriate. Every conversation felt like an exam I hadn't prepared for. She spoke in rules and clauses, in phrases like community standards and neighborhood integrity. The thing was, I wasn't violating any of them. I checked, over and over. I kept copies, highlighted sections. But logic didn't slow her down. If anything, it sharpened her focus. I started to feel observed. Not paranoid, just aware, like every small action had an audience, and that audience was waiting for me to make a mistake. Still, I assumed it would blow over. People like that usually burn out. They move on. They find a bigger problem to obsess over. So I kept my head down and worked. Then Monday arrived. I remember it because something felt wrong before I could explain why. I walked into the kitchen and didn't hear the soft hum from the fridge panel, reminding me the door was open. My phone hadn't buzzed with overnight alerts. The smart thermostat screen was black. I checked my phone. No Wi-Fi, no signal, no cellular data, loading anything useful. At first, I shrugged. Outages happen. I threw on a hoodie, poured some coffee, and decided to check the external junction box before calling anyone. Old habit. Control what you can before escalating. The weather was perfect. No wind, no rain, no obvious reason for failure. When I rounded the back fence, I saw it immediately. The cable was gone. Not torn, not chewed, not accidentally nicked by a lawn tool. Cleanly cut. A precise break right where the fiber dropped into the ground box. Whoever did it hadn't rushed. They hadn't panicked. They'd measured, cut, and walked away. I stood there, staring, feeling that slow, heavy drop in my chest. The kind that tells you this isn't a minor inconvenience. This is deliberate. I called the provider. They checked their system. Everything upstream was fine. The neighborhood was live. My line, they said, was dark. We'll have a crew out tomorrow morning. The rep said, cheerful in that scripted way. She offered a temporary hotspot in the meantime. I didn't bother explaining how useless that would be for my work. I hadn't even ended the call when I heard footsteps on my porch. Lorraine stood there like she'd been waiting for her cue. Hair perfect, clipboard tucked under her arm, eyes sharp. You should really be more mindful of how your cables are run, she said, gesturing past me toward the yard. It's not very becoming, and it can cause issues. Something tightened in my jaw. Are you saying you cut it? I asked. She blinked once. Slow, measured. Of course not, she said. I just noticed it that way. And I reported it like I'm supposed to. That was the moment I knew this wasn't finished. Not even close. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was angry, exactly, but because my brain wouldn't let go of the pattern. The clean cut, the timing, her showing up minutes after my call. Lorraine liked documentation. She liked being first. First to report. First to frame the story. If something went wrong in this neighborhood, she wanted her version locked in before anyone else realized there was a problem. By sunrise, the outage had already started creeping into my workday. I sent a short message to my supervisor. Careful, vague, infrastructure issue, provider dispatched, working on redundancy, calm language, the kind that buys you a little grace. Around 8:30, the first truck pulled up, a white utility van. No permanent markings, just a magnetic logo stuck to the door. 2 techs stepped out, both holding coffee, both carrying that worn, competent look of people who fix the same preventable problems over and over again. I led them around to the back fence. One of the techs crouched, ran his fingers along the outer sheath, and let out a low whistle. Yeah, this isn't weather, he said. That's a tool cut. Clean. On purpose. I asked if he could splice it. He shook his head. We'll need to rerun the drop and test upstream. Shouldn't take long, but we have to document this, especially considering what this line feeds into. He paused, glanced at me from the side. You work remote, right? Government contract. I nodded but didn't offer details. I didn't need to. That was enough. He stepped away and made a call. I couldn't hear every word, but I heard enough to feel that familiar chill, the one you get when something small suddenly plugs into a much larger machine. Dedicated circuit, commercial exchange, monitoring flag, language that doesn't belong on a quiet street, with bird feeders and chalk drawings on the sidewalk. Within an hour, the street began to shift. Another van arrived, then a dark sedan I didn't recognize, then another. They parked carefully. No blocked driveways, no obvious spectacle, and somehow drew every eye anyway. Blinds twitched, doors cracked open. Someone across the street shut off their mower and just stood there, hands on hips, watching. Lorraine appeared at the edge of her driveway, clutching her clipboard like it might keep her afloat. She looked unsettled, still composed, but there was a tightness around her mouth I hadn't seen before. This was outside her comfort zone. These weren't HOA warnings or violation notices. This wasn't something she could manage with a form letter. 2 men and a woman approached me. Professional, polite, calm in that way that suggests their use of the sorter and don't need to advertise urgency. They asked for my ID, asked me to confirm my job, my schedule, the last time my connection had been stable. I answered carefully, honestly, the way you do when you know precision matters more than speed. One of them nodded while taking notes and explained that the severed cable had briefly interrupted a routed communications path tied into a monitored system. Nothing dramatic, nothing catastrophic, just enough to trigger a protocol review. In other words, my missing internet had set off an alarm someone much higher up the chain cared about. That's when they turned toward Lorraine. Ma'am, one of them said, would you mind answering a few questions? She smiled, too fast, too rehearsed. Of course, she said. I'm the HOA president. I keep detailed records of everything that happens here. She launched into her explanation before they'd finished asking. how she noticed the cable during her morning walk, how she reported it immediately, how deeply she cared about community standards, how dangerous exposed infrastructure could be. They listened. They always do. Then they asked about timing. "What time was your walk, ma'am?" She hesitated. "Just a beat. Long enough to matter." "Early," she said. "Around 6. The woman with the notepad tilted her head slightly. "Interesting," she said, "because the service interruption registered at 2:14 a.m. Lorraine's fingers tightened around the clipboard. I watched from a few steps away, heart thudding, not with satisfaction, but with disbelief. I hadn't planned this. I hadn't set anything in motion. I just wanted my connection restored. But now the system was awake, and it didn't care about neighborhood politics. They asked where she'd been the night before, who had access to the alley behind the houses, whether she owned tools capable of cutting reinforced fiber. She answered quickly, too quickly. That's when a voice came from across the alley. Greg, quiet guy, IT consultant, kept to himself. He raised his hand like he was back in school. "I don't want to cause trouble," he said, "but my security camera might have something." Every head turned. He pulled up the footage on his phone. Grainy night vision. Clear timestamp. 2:12 a.m. Lorraine. Unmistakable even in infrared. Walking along the fence. Stopping. Bending down. Standing back up. The street went dead silent. Color drained from her face. That clip changed everything. The agents didn't raise their voices. They didn't accuse her outright. They simply adjusted course. Asked her to step aside. Requested consent to review call logs. Asked her to clarify earlier statements. The clipboard slipped from her hand and hit the concrete with a sharp crack. By late morning, the repair crew had finished rerunning the line. Tests came back clean. My modem lit up solid and steady. The connection returned faster than it ever had before. But the real damage was already done. Statements were recorded, evidence cataloged. The severed cable was sealed in a bag and tagged. Lorraine was escorted back to her house. No cuffs, no scene, just the unmistakable weight of consequence settling onto her shoulders. By noon, the HOA board called an emergency meeting. No snacks, no small talk, just facts spread across folding tables, and a room full of people realizing they'd handed authority to the wrong person for far too long. Lorraine didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The footage spoke. The logs did too. The agent's silence filled in the rest. The vote was fast. Unanimous. She was removed as president pending the outcome of the investigation. When I stepped back into my house that afternoon, everything felt different. Not safer. Not victorious. Just quieter. Like a storm had passed without breaking anything, yet somehow rearranged the entire room. I sat at my desk, watched packets move cleanly across my monitor, and wondered how something so small had grown so large, and whether it was truly finished yet. The thing about consequences is they don't arrive all at once. They seep in, quietly. They change the air long, before anyone realizes the furniture has been moved. By the time evening settled in, the street had eased back into something that almost passed for normal. Kids were out again on scooters. Chalk streaked the sidewalk like nothing of consequence had happened. Someone a couple houses down fired up a grill. A lawn sprinkler clicked steadily in the heat. If you hadn't been there that morning, you might have missed the meaning entirely. But for those who knew, everything felt slightly wrong, like hearing a familiar song played in the wrong key. I sat in my garage office with the door open, listening to the low, steady hum of my equipment. That sound mattered more to me than I'd ever admitted, not just because it meant I could work, but because it meant the world was behaving the way it should. Cause and effect, input and output, systems responding the way they were designed to. Around sunset, I noticed her across the street. Lorraine stood at the edge of her driveway, arms folded, staring at nothing in particular. No clipboard, no paperwork, just her, reduced to a silhouette against her own house. For the first time since I'd moved in, she looked unsure where she fit. I hadn't planned on walking over. I really hadn't. Every rational thought told me to leave it alone. Let the process handle what processes handle. But there was something unfinished hanging in the air between us, and I knew if I ignored it, it would linger longer than I wanted. So I grabbed 2 coffees from my kitchen, crossed the street, and stopped a few feet away. I held one out. She looked at it like it might explode. "I don't want anything from you," she said. "That's fine," I replied. "I just thought I'd offer." There was a long pause, the kind where you become aware of your own breathing. Finally, she took it. "They're making me out to be some kind of criminal," she said, staring into the cup. I was just enforcing the rules. I leaned against the hood of my car. "Rules don't include cutting someone's property," I said, "and they definitely don't include triggering a federal investigation." Her jaw tightened. "You don't understand what it takes to keep order," she said. "If you let one thing slide, everything slides. People stop caring. They stop listening." I almost laughed, but there was too much sadness tangled up in it. "You weren't keeping order," I said. "You were controlling people. There's a difference." She didn't argue. That silence said more than any defense could have. I thought about all the times she'd stood at the end of my driveway, all the warnings and violations that never quite landed. It had never really been about cables or antennas. It was about power, about being the one who decided what was acceptable. And when she could no longer decide, she cut the line instead. I left her there with the coffee and went back inside. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. After that, the investigation moved slowly and quietly. No sirens, no dramatic arrests, just paperwork, interviews, and follow-ups. I was asked to provide logs showing how the outage affected my work. I sent them. I was told the case could result in fines, restitution, or charges if intent was formally established. Intent. That was a word everything hinged on. It always is. Lorraine stopped showing up to neighborhood events. Her house went dark earlier than usual. When people passed her, they nodded politely but didn't linger. The invisible authority she warned everyone about for years had vanished, and without it, she seemed unsure how to occupy space. The HOA elected an interim president, a soft-spoken woman named Denise who opened meetings by asking how people were doing, and actually waited for answers. Violations dropped. Conversations stretched out. The neighborhood exhaled. A week later, a note appeared in my mailbox. No name, just one sentence. Some line should never be crossed. I stood there for a while holding it, wondering who'd written it. Maybe Greg, maybe Denise, maybe someone who'd been afraid to speak before. Or maybe it was the neighborhood itself, trying to make sense of what had happened. Because here's the part no one really talks about. Lorraine didn't wake up one morning and decide to be the villain. She didn't see herself that way. In her mind, she was protecting something fragile, a sense of order, a version of community that made sense to her. But somewhere along the way, enforcement turned into entitlement. Authority turned into ownership. And when she felt that ownership threatened, she acted. That's usually how it goes. A month later, I saw her again at the grocery store. She avoided eye contact, looked smaller somehow. I thought about saying something about closure, but I realized closure isn't something you hand to someone. It's something they find on their own. My internet has been flawless ever since. Faster, if anything, the provider upgraded the line, added extra monitoring, flagged it as sensitive infrastructure. Sometimes I check the logs, watching the green indicators pulse steadily, and I can't help but smile at the absurdity of it all. One cut cable, one bad decision, and suddenly a quiet suburban street brushed up against systems far larger than itself. People like to think justice is loud, that it arrives with flashing lights and dramatic speeches. Most of the time, it isn't. It's quiet, procedural, unemotional. It shows up in timestamps, documentation, and conversations behind closed doors. And it doesn't care who you are in your own story. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Lorraine had just knocked on my door that night, if she'd said she was worried, if she'd asked instead of acting. Maybe none of this would have happened. Maybe we'd still be exchanging polite nods across the driveway. But she didn't. She crossed a line that wasn't hers to cross. And the world responded the only way it knows how, calmly, thoroughly, permanently. So I'll leave you with this. If you were in her place, would you have done the same thing? Convinced you were right? If you were in mine, would you have pushed back or let it slide to keep the peace? And where do you draw the line between rules that protect a community and power that slowly poisons it? Let me know what you think in the comments. I read everyone.